Admiral Sarah Chen stood before the massive viewport of the UNS Defiance, watching the stars wheel slowly past as the dreadnought maintained its patrol route through what the galaxy now called the neutral zone. To most observers, her ship appeared to be conducting routine peacekeeping operations, a visible symbol of humanity's commitment to the peace accords signed 2 years ago on Kepler Station. The aliens had been so pleased with themselves that day. Chen remembered the smug satisfaction radiating from the Zeltheron delegation as they watched humanity's representatives sign away their rights to military expansion. The insectoid creatures had clicked their mandibles in what passed for laughter when the human ambassador agreed to limit their fleet to defensive operations only within designated sectors. Chen's reflection was interrupted by her communications officer, Lieutenant Martinez, whose voice carried carefully controlled tension. "Admiral, we're receiving encrypted transmissions from Scout Fleet Tango 7. They're reporting massive coalition buildups in the Arcturus and Vega systems." The Admiral turned from the viewport, her weathered face showing no emotion. At 53, Sarah Chen had commanded ships during humanity's expansion into the outer colonies, had fought pirates in the asteroid belts, and had been present at first contact when the Galactic Coalition had welcomed humanity to the cosmic community. She understood better than most what that welcome had really meant. "How massive?" she asked, moving to her command chair with the fluid economy of movement that came from decades in zero gravity. Martinez consulted his displays, his young face pale in the blue glow of the tactical screens. "Conservative estimates put it at over 400 capital ships, Admiral. That's more firepower than they've assembled since the Krillian War 50 years ago." Chen's executive officer, Commander James Walsh, looked up from his own station where he had been monitoring fleet communications across the human sectors. "Ma'am, it gets worse. We're detecting similar buildups in 17 other systems. All of them border territories that were designated as neutral under the peace accords." The bridge fell silent except for the soft hum of the ship's systems. Every officer present knew what those numbers meant. The Coalition wasn't preparing for a police action or a border dispute. They were preparing for conquest on a scale that would dwarf any previous galactic conflict. Chen activated her personal communicator, establishing a secure link to Earth Command. The face that appeared on her screen belonged to Admiral Rebecca Torres, the Chief of Naval Operations and one of the few people in the galaxy who knew the truth about humanity's peaceful intentions. "Sarah," Torres said without preamble, "I take it you've seen the intelligence reports." 400 ships in Arcturus alone," Chen confirmed. "They're not even trying to hide it anymore. The question is, do we stick to the timetable or accelerate?" Torres was quiet for a moment, her dark eyes reflecting calculations that involved the lives of billions across the galaxy. "The President has authorized Condition Yellow as of 20 minutes ago. All fleet commanders are to proceed to Phase 2 immediately." Chen felt a cold smile touch her lips. Phase 2. The aliens thought they understood human military doctrine because they had studied the wars humans fought among themselves. They had analyzed the tactics, the strategies, the technologies that humanity employed when fighting for resources or territory or ideology, but they had never seen humans fight for survival. They had never witnessed what happened when humanity felt genuinely threatened. And most importantly, they had never encountered the level of preparation that humans were capable of when they had 2 full years to plan for the inevitable betrayal they had seen coming from the moment the peace accords were signed. "Understood, Admiral," Chen replied. "Defiance is ready to begin Phase 2 operations." "See that you are," Torres said. "And Sarah, remember that everything we've worked for depends on the next 72 hours. The Coalition thinks they're about to witness the end of human expansion. They're about to learn the difference between expansion and preparation." The transmission ended, leaving the bridge in contemplative silence. Chen turned to her crew, men and women who had served with her for years, who had trained for this moment even as they participated in the elaborate theater that had convinced the galaxy of humanity's peaceful intentions. "Lieutenant Martinez," she said, "send a priority message to all ships in the flotilla. Authorization code Prometheus 7. Tell them it's time to drop the mask." As Martinez began transmitting the coded orders that would ripple throughout the human fleet, Chen reflected on the events that had led to this moment. The Galactic Coalition had approached humanity with what they presented as generous terms for joining the galactic community. Territories would be allocated, trade agreements would be established, cultural exchanges would flourish. What they had really offered was a cage. A carefully constructed set of limitations designed to prevent humanity from becoming the threat that their own xenobiologists and military analysts had identified. The Coalition had studied human history and had seen the pattern. Wherever humans went, they adapted, they thrived, and they eventually dominated. The aliens had made their offer from a position of overwhelming superiority. 3,000 years of galactic civilization, technologies that seemed like magic to human scientists, military forces that numbered in the millions of ships across hundreds of systems. But they had made one crucial error in their calculations. They had assumed that humans would react to the peace treaty the same way that every other species had reacted to coalition guidance over the millennia. They expected humanity to accept the limitations, to gradually become dependent on coalition technology and trade, and to slowly lose the aggressive edge that made them dangerous. Instead, humanity had said yes to the treaty and had immediately begun the largest military preparation in their history. The peace accords had included strict limitations on human military forces, no more than 500 capital ships, no weapons research beyond specified parameters, no military installations outside of designated defensive zones. What the treaty hadn't addressed was retrofitting civilian infrastructure for military purposes. It hadn't anticipated the conversion of mining operations into weapons manufacturing facilities. It hadn't considered the possibility that humans would use the 2-year peace dividend to completely revolutionize their approach to warfare. Chen's science officer, Elena Vasquez, approached her command chair carrying a datapad that displayed information so classified that it existed only in hard copy form, never entering any computer system that might be monitored by coalition intelligence. "Admiral Dr. Vasquez said quietly, "The final calibrations for Project Damocles are complete. We have confirmation from all 37 sites. The orbital platforms are ready for activation. Project Damocles." Even the name was designed to send a message. The Coalition had studied human mythology along with human history, but apparently they had never fully grasped the implications of the story about the sword hanging by a thread over the head of the powerful. For 2 years, while human diplomats had smiled and attended cultural exchange programs, human engineers had been quietly deploying the most sophisticated weapons platforms ever conceived, not ships that could be detected and counted, but installations hidden within asteroids, moons, and abandoned space stations throughout the galaxy. Each platform was equipped with technology that represented the absolute pinnacle of human innovation, driven by the desperate creativity that only emerged when survival was at stake. Quantum communication arrays that could coordinate attacks across thousands of light years instantly. Weapon systems that could crack planets or precision target individual ships with equal efficiency. Cloaking technology that made the platforms invisible to every known form of detection. The Coalition had congratulated themselves on limiting humanity to 500 capital ships. They had never realized that humans had built something far more dangerous, a network of hidden weapons that could reach every major population center in Coalition space. Chen's tactical officer, Commander Lisa Park, announced that the final pieces were moving into position. "Admiral, we're receiving confirmation from Stealth Group Alpha. They've reached firing positions in the Centauri system. Admiral Harrison reports that the Coalition's primary fleet anchorage is completely unaware of their presence." The Centauri system housed the Coalition's largest naval base, a massive complex of shipyards, training facilities, and strategic reserves that represented the heart of their military power. For 18 months, human stealth ships had been infiltrating the system disguised as merchant vessels or scientific expeditions. Those ships were now in position to deliver a strike that would cripple the Coalition's ability to project force across the galaxy. But that was only the beginning. Chen activated the ship's internal communication system, her voice reaching every member of her crew. "All hands, this is the Admiral. As of this moment, the Terran Coalition peace accords are officially suspended. What you are about to witness is not an act of aggression. It is a response to an act of war that the Coalition began the moment they decided that humanity could be contained." She paused, knowing that her words were being recorded, that they would eventually be analyzed by historians trying to understand how the galaxy had changed so completely in the space of a few hours. "For 2 years, we have allowed them to believe that they had successfully neutralized the human threat. We have played the role of the grateful newcomers, accepting their guidance and their limitations. We have let them think that they understood us." Commander Walsh looked up from his station where countdown timers were beginning to appear on multiple screens. "Admiral, all ships report ready. We have positive locks on targets throughout Coalition space." Chen nodded, feeling the weight of the moment. In the next few minutes, everything would change. The careful balance of power that had maintained galactic peace for centuries was about to be shattered, replaced by something that no alien civilization had ever experienced: humanity unleashed. "They wanted to see our military capabilities," she said, her voice carrying across the bridge and through the ship's communication system to every human vessel hidden throughout the galaxy. "They demanded that we prove we could be trusted with responsibility of cosmic citizenship." The countdown timers reached their final moments. synchronized across hundreds of hidden installations and thousands of ships that the Coalition had never known existed. "Very well," Admiral Chen said, her finger hovering over the authorization key that would begin humanity's true introduction to galactic warfare. "Let's show them what trust really means." The first indication that something was wrong came to Coalition Admiral Thektar through a routine sensor sweep of the Zentari system. The Zeltharan's compound eyes were designed to process multiple data streams simultaneously, but even his enhanced visual cortex struggled to comprehend what his tactical displays were showing him. Signatures were appearing throughout the system. Not the gradual emergence of ships dropping out of hyperspace, but the sudden materialization of objects that had apparently been present all along, hidden by technology that shouldn't have existed. "Sensor Chief." Thektar clicked in the formal dialect reserved for combat situations. "Explain these readings immediately." The junior officer's mandibles trembled as she consulted her instruments. "Admiral, we are detecting approximately 200 unidentified vessels within weapons range of the primary fleet anchorage. They appear to have been cloaked using some form of stealth technology that our sensors cannot penetrate. 200 ships in the most secure system in Coalition space, protected by sensor networks that could detect a grain of sand moving at relativistic speeds." Thektar's secondary brain, the one that handled tactical calculations, immediately understood the implications. If the humans had 200 ships here, in the heart of Coalition military power, then the peace accords had been a deception from the beginning. Every promise, every limitation, every carefully negotiated clause had been nothing more than theater designed to buy time. Thektar was activating his emergency communications when the human vessels opened fire. The first salvo came not from energy weapons or kinetic projectiles, but from devices that seemed to fold space itself around Coalition vessels. Ships that had been there one moment simply vanished, leaving behind expanding spheres of exotic particles that registered on sensors for only a few seconds before dissipating. The second wave of attacks targeted the shipyard facilities themselves. Beams of coherent gravity warped the massive construction platforms into impossible geometries, crushing them into dense spheres of metal and composite that immediately began falling toward the system's primary star. Thektar's communication attempts were met with static. Emergency frequencies, military channels, even civilian networks were being jammed by interference that seemed to originate from everywhere at once. The humans hadn't just infiltrated the system. They had taken control of it. On his primary tactical display, a new contact appeared, a single ship, much larger than the stealth vessels that had delivered the initial attack. As it approached, Thektar's sensors began providing details that defied everything he thought he knew about human technology. The ship was over 3 kilometers long, its hull composed of materials that seemed to absorb sensor pings rather than reflecting them. More disturbing were the energy readings coming from its core. The power output was equivalent to a small star, contained within a vessel that somehow remained stable despite forces that should have torn it apart at the molecular level. A communication request appeared on Thektar's display. The transmission was coming through channels that the Coalition had thought were completely secure, encrypted with algorithms that would have taken centuries to break. Thektar accepted the transmission and found himself looking at a human face for the first time in over a year. The woman who appeared on his screen was perhaps middle-aged by human standards, with iron-gray hair and eyes that seemed to catalog every detail of his command bridge. "Admiral Thektar," the human said, her voice carrying through the translation matrix with unsettling clarity. "I am Admiral Sarah Chen of the United Nations Space Command. I am contacting you to inform you that the Terran Coalition peace accords are hereby terminated." Thektar's mandibles clicked involuntarily as his sensors continued to register impossible readings from throughout the system. "Admiral Chen, this is an unprovoked act of war." "The peace accords specifically?" "The peace accords," Chen interrupted, "were violated the moment your fleets began massing for an invasion of human territory. We have been monitoring Coalition military buildups for the past 6 months. 4,000 ships positioned to strike at neutral zones. Plans to occupy systems that were designated as off-limits under the very treaty you claim we have broken." The human's words hit Thektar like a physical blow. The Coalition military buildup was supposed to have been completely secret, hidden from human intelligence by layers of security that had taken decades to perfect. "How?" Thektar found himself asking before he could stop himself. Chen's smile was not reassuring. "Admiral, for 2 years you have been studying us, learning our capabilities, analyzing our technology, preparing to neutralize us as a threat. What you failed to consider is that we were studying you as well." The tactical display behind Chen showed a real-time map of Coalition space. Red indicators were appearing throughout the galaxy, each one marking a human presence that the Coalition had never detected, bases that had been disguised as civilian installations. Ships that had been hidden among asteroid fields and nebulae, weapons platforms that had been concealed within the very trade stations where Coalition and human diplomats had met to celebrate their peaceful cooperation. The difference, Chen continued, is that we actually learned from our observations. Thektar's communication officer was desperately trying to establish contact with other Coalition forces, but the reports that filtered through the jamming were increasingly disturbing. Human attacks were occurring simultaneously across dozens of systems. Not the random strikes of raiders or rebels, but a coordinated assault that demonstrated a level of preparation that should have been impossible. "What do you want?" Thektar asked, his voice carrying the resignation of a commander who had suddenly realized that everything he had believed about the strategic situation was wrong. Chen's expression became more serious. "We want what we have always wanted, Admiral. The right to exist without having our destiny controlled by others. The Coalition approached us with an offer of membership, but what you really offered was submission. You wanted to ensure that humanity would never become a threat to the established order. On the tactical display, more human ships were decloaking throughout the system. Not just the advanced stealth vessels that had delivered the initial attack, but massive dreadnoughts that dwarfed anything in the Coalition fleet. The energy signatures coming from their weapons systems were unlike anything Thektar had encountered in 3 decades of military service. The peace accords included specific limitations on human military forces," Thektar protested. "Your compliance was verified by our inspection teams." Chen nodded. "Your teams inspected exactly what we wanted them to inspect. They confirmed that we had 500 capital ships, as specified in the treaty. They verified that our weapons research was limited to approved parameters. They cataloged our military installations and found them to be within designated defensive zones." The human admiral paused, allowing Thektar time to process the implications of her words. What they didn't realize is that humans have a different definition of military assets than the rest of the galaxy. When you limited us to 500 capital ships, you assumed that ships were our primary military capability. When you restricted our weapons research, you thought you were preventing us from developing new technologies. Chen gestured to something off-screen, and new information began appearing on Thektar's tactical display. Technical specifications for weapons systems that seemed to violate the fundamental laws of physics. Power sources that drew energy from dimensions that Coalition science insisted were purely theoretical. Manufacturing capabilities that could transform raw matter into finished military hardware at the quantum level. "What you failed to understand," Chen explained, "is that humans don't just build weapons, we become weapons. Every civilian industrial facility in human space can be converted to military production within hours. Every merchant ship can be retrofitted as a warship. Every human colony is a potential military base." Thektar's compound eyes widened as he began to grasp the scope of what the humans had accomplished. The peace accords had been designed to prevent humanity from building a traditional military force. Instead, they had built something entirely different. A civilization that could transform itself into a military machine at will.
"The 500 ships your inspectors counted?" Chen continued. "They were decoys."
"Functional vessels, but designed primarily to convince you that you understood our capabilities. Our actual fleet consists of approximately 50,000 vessels, most of which have been disguised as civilian craft for the past 2 years. 50,000 ships." Thektar's tactical brain struggled to process the number. The entire Coalition fleet numbered less than 30,000 vessels, accumulated over 3 millennia of galactic expansion. Chen's communication was interrupted by reports from throughout Coalition space. Human forces were striking simultaneously at military bases, shipyards, and command centers across hundreds of systems. But these weren't the chaotic attacks of an aggressive species seeking to conquer territory. They were surgical strikes designed to cripple the Coalition's ability to coordinate a response. "Admiral," Chen said, her voice taking on a tone that Thektar recognized as a formal military communication, "I am instructed to offer you terms for surrender. Surrender." In 3,000 years of galactic expansion, the Coalition had never encountered a species capable of forcing them to consider surrender. "What terms?" Thektar asked, knowing that his career and possibly his life depended on the answer. Chen's expression became almost sympathetic. "The Coalition will immediately cease all military operations in human-claimed space. You will withdraw your forces to positions held prior to the recent military buildup. In exchange, human forces will limit their operations to defensive actions within our established territories." Thektar felt a surge of hope. Despite their overwhelming display of power, the humans were offering terms that were essentially a return to the status quo. "However," Chen continued, and the hope died as quickly as it had emerged, "the peace accords are permanently terminated. Humanity will no longer accept limitations on our military capabilities or expansion. We will establish colonies where we choose, build whatever military forces we deem necessary, and conduct our affairs as a sovereign civilization. The human admiral paused, allowing Thektar to consider the implications. The coalition had spent centuries establishing the principle that expansion was limited by mutual agreement. If humanity rejected that principle, it would fundamentally alter the balance of power in the galaxy. These terms are unacceptable, Chen added. Then we will proceed with Phase 3 of our operations. Thektar's mandibles clicked involuntarily. What is Phase 3? Chen's smile returned, but this time there was nothing reassuring about it. Phase 3 involves demonstrating that our current operations have been what humans call a police action. If the Coalition chooses to continue this conflict, you will discover what humans are capable of when we stop holding back. The communication ended, leaving Thektar alone with his thoughts and the overwhelming evidence of how completely the Coalition had misjudged humanity. On his tactical display, human forces continued to operate throughout Coalition space with impunity, striking targets with precision that suggested they had been planning these operations from the moment the peace accords were signed. As reports continued to arrive from across the galaxy, Thektar began to understand that this was not just a military defeat. It was a fundamental change in the nature of galactic civilization. For 3,000 years, the Coalition had been the dominant force in known space, guiding the development of younger species and maintaining the peace through overwhelming technological and numerical superiority. Now they faced a species that had not just matched their capabilities, but had done so while pretending to accept limitations that they had never intended to honor. The humans had spent 2 years studying Coalition weaknesses, infiltrating their most secure systems and preparing for a conflict that they had known was inevitable. Thektar activated his emergency communicator, knowing that he was about to deliver news that would reshape every strategic calculation in Coalition space. The humans were not the controlled junior partners that the peace accords had been designed to create. They were a force that could challenge the Coalition's dominance of the galaxy, and they had just announced their intention to do exactly that. The emergency session of the Galactic Coalition Council convened in the ancient chambers on Prima Centralis, the capital world that had served as the seat of galactic government for over 2 millennia. Representatives from 47 species gathered in the vast amphitheater, their various forms of communication creating a cacophony that the universal translation system struggled to process. High Chancellor Vorthak of the Zeltheron hegemony called for order with a gesture of his primary manipulator appendages. The insectoid leader had held his position for over 2 centuries, guiding the Coalition through periods of expansion, integration, and peaceful development. Nothing in his extensive experience had prepared him for the crisis reports that had been flooding in for the past 18 hours. Esteemed colleagues, Vortak began, his voice carrying the weight of his years and the gravity of the situation, we convene this emergency session in response to unprecedented aggression by the human species. As you have all received the preliminary reports, I will begin with a comprehensive briefing from Supreme Military Commander Keltar. The Krillian commander rose from his position in the military advisors section, his crystalline carapace reflecting the chamber's lights in patterns that indicated severe stress. Keltar had commanded coalition forces during the last major conflict 50 years ago, and his tactical assessments were regarded as the finest in known space. Honored Council, Keltar began, his voice resonating through the translation matrix with mechanical precision. The human attack represents the most significant military action in coalition history. In the span of 6 hours, human forces struck simultaneously at 43 separate systems across 12 sectors. The holographic display at the center of the chamber activated, showing a 3-dimensional map of coalition space. Red indicators appeared throughout the display, each one marking a location where human forces had revealed themselves and engaged coalition assets. The scope of the operation suggests a level of preparation and coordination that we severely underestimated, Keltar continued. Human forces demonstrated technologies that our xenobiology teams had classified as theoretically impossible for a species at their developmental level. Ambassador Ceylin of the Ethereal Collective, her translucent form shifting colors to indicate deep concern, interrupted the briefing. Commander, our understanding was that human military capabilities were strictly limited by the peace accords. How were they able to deploy forces of this magnitude without detection? Keltar's carapace darkened, a sign of what humans would have recognized as embarrassment. Ambassador, our intelligence services now believe that the humans never intended to honor the limitations specified in the peace accords. They have spent the past 2 years engaged in what can only be described as the most sophisticated deception operation in galactic history. The display changed to show detailed analysis of human installations that coalition intelligence had identified as civilian facilities, mining operations that were actually weapons manufacturing plants, research stations that were military command centers, trading posts that were forward operating bases for the human fleet. Every inspection we conducted, every verification we performed, was apparently orchestrated to show us exactly what the humans wanted us to see, Keltar explained. They constructed elaborate facades that convinced our best intelligence analysts that human military capabilities were limited to what was specified in the treaty. Chancellor Vorthak's mandibles clicked in agitation. What are the strategic implications? Can the coalition respond effectively to this deception? Keltar's pause was long enough that several council members began exchanging concerned communications in their native languages. Honored Chancellor, Keltar said finally, the humans appear to have achieved approximate parity with coalition military forces. Their ships utilize technologies that are in some cases superior to our most advanced designs. Their coordination and tactical execution exceed anything we have previously encountered. The chamber erupted in chaos as representatives from dozens of species attempted to speak simultaneously. The Aquatic Federation's delegation released chemical signals that indicated panic. The Machine Collective's representatives began processing data at rates that caused their crystalline matrices to glow with increased activity. Vortak restored order with difficulty, his authority challenged for the first time in his long career by the unprecedented nature of the crisis. Ambassador Takara of the Philosophical Union managed to gain recognition to speak. Her species was known for their analytical approach to complex problems, and her words carried weight throughout the council. If I understand correctly, Takara began, the humans have demonstrated that they possess military capabilities equivalent to the combined forces of the coalition, hidden while maintaining the appearance of compliance with treaty limitations. This suggests a level of strategic thinking that we have not encountered in previous first contacts. Keltar nodded grimly. Ambassador Takara's assessment is accurate. However, the situation is actually worse than simple military parity. The humans have demonstrated the ability to project force throughout coalition space simultaneously, suggesting a logistics capability that surpasses our own. The tactical display shifted to show the timing of the human attacks. Strikes had occurred within minutes of each other across distances that should have required weeks to traverse even with the most advanced hyperspace drives. They have apparently developed some form of instantaneous communication and coordination technology, Keltar explained. Every human operation was synchronized to a degree that should be impossible across galactic distances. Ambassador Morden of the Commercial Guild, whose species had been responsible for much of the economic integration that had made the coalition prosperous, raised a question that cut to the heart of the political implications. Commander Keltar, what were the human demands? If this was a political demonstration rather than an attempt at conquest, there must have been terms offered. Keltar activated a new section of the display, showing the text of the communication that Admiral Chen had transmitted to coalition forces throughout the affected systems. The humans demand complete termination of the peace accords and recognition of their right to unrestricted expansion and military development. They want the coalition to treat them as equals rather than as a species under guidance. The implications hit the council like a physical blow. For 3,000 years, the coalition had maintained galactic stability by ensuring that no single species or alliance could challenge their authority. Younger civilizations were integrated gradually, accepting limitations on their development in exchange for access to advanced technology and trade networks. If humanity rejected this system and possessed the military capability to enforce their rejection, it would fundamentally alter the structure of galactic civilization. Chancellor Vortak consulted with his advisors before addressing the council again. Has the Supreme Military Command developed response options? Keltar's crystalline structure darkened further. Honored Chancellor, our analysis suggests that a direct military confrontation with human forces would result in casualties exceeding 50% of coalition fleet strength, with no guarantee of success. The chamber fell silent as the representatives absorbed this assessment. The coalition had never faced a potential adversary capable of inflicting such casualties. However, Keltar continued, there may be alternative approaches. Human civilization, despite its military capabilities, remains dependent on trade relationships and resource extraction from systems outside their direct control. Economic pressure might achieve what military action cannot. Ambassador Veltar of the Resource Consortium immediately responded. Commander, the humans have been extraordinarily self-sufficient throughout their membership in the coalition. They have consistently refused offers of technological assistance and have developed their industrial capacity independently. The display shifted again to show economic data from human territories. Unlike most coalition member species, humanity had never become dependent on external trade for critical resources. Their colonies were designed for complete self-sufficiency, and their manufacturing capabilities appeared to be entirely internal. It appears, Keltar said, that the humans have been preparing for economic isolation as well as military conflict. They anticipated that we might attempt to use trade relationships as leverage. Ambassador Takara requested permission to speak again. If the humans possess military parity with the coalition in economic independence, what prevents them from simply expanding their territory by force? It was the question that everyone in the chamber had been avoiding. If humanity could match coalition military power and didn't require coalition resources, what incentive did they have to negotiate rather than conquer? Keltar activated a final section of his briefing, showing strategic analysis that painted an even more disturbing picture. Our xenobiological studies suggest that humans are fundamentally different from other species in their approach to expansion. Most civilizations seek to control resources or territory. Humans appear to be driven by concepts that our analysts describe as freedom and self-determination. Chancellor Vorthak's confusion was evident in his posture. Explain the strategic implications of these concepts. Honored Chancellor, humans appear to be willing to fight indefinitely to avoid external control, regardless of the costs involved. Unlike territorial expansion, which has limits determined by resources and logistics, their desire for independence appears to be absolute. The chamber's atmosphere grew heavy with the implications. The coalition had dealt with aggressive species before, but aggression was predictable. It could be channeled, redirected, or exhausted, but an enemy fighting for philosophical principles rather than material gain represented a new and potentially unmanageable threat. Ambassador Selin's form shifted to colors indicating deep thoughtfulness. Commander, what assessment do you make of the human offer? They presented terms rather than simply attacking. This suggests they prefer negotiation to warfare. Keltar's response carried a note of uncertainty that was unusual for his analytical species. The human communication suggested that their current operations were limited demonstrations of capability. They implied that they could escalate to significantly higher levels of conflict if their terms were rejected. What could be worse than simultaneous attacks across 43 systems? Chancellor Vorthak asked. Unknown, Honored Chancellor. However, if their current operations represent limited demonstrations, then their full military capability may exceed our most pessimistic estimates by significant margins. The council chamber fell silent as the representatives contemplated the implications. They faced a species that had spent 2 years systematically deceiving them while preparing for a conflict that none of them had seen coming. That same species was now offering terms that would fundamentally alter the galactic balance of power. The alternative was continuing a war against an enemy whose full capabilities remained unknown, but whose demonstrated power had already exceeded everything the Coalition thought possible. Chancellor Vortak called for a recess to allow for private consultations among the various factions and species represented in the council. As the chamber emptied, he remained behind with his closest advisors, contemplating a decision that would determine the future of galactic civilization. For the first time in 3,000 years, the Coalition faced an equal. The question was whether they would accept that equality or risk everything in an attempt to maintain their dominance. The Coalition's response came 72 hours after the initial human demonstration. Chancellor Vorthak's message was transmitted simultaneously to every human colony, research station, and diplomatic facility in known space. The formal diplomatic language could not disguise the underlying defiance. Admiral Sarah Chen received the transmission aboard the UNS Defiance, while her task force maintained position in the neutral zone. As she read the Chancellor's words, she felt the familiar mixture of disappointment and inevitability that had characterized her interactions with the Coalition from the beginning. The Galactic Coalition Council, the message read, rejects the human demands for unrestricted expansion and military development. While we acknowledge that certain misunderstandings have occurred regarding human capabilities, we cannot permit the abandonment of the principles that have maintained galactic peace for 3 millennia. Chen's executive officer, Commander Walsh, looked up from his own copy of the message. They're calling our bluff, Admiral. They think they're calling our bluff, Chen corrected. The difference is important. The Coalition's message continued with terms that amounted to a slightly modified version of the original peace accords. Humanity would be permitted to increase their official fleet size to 1,000 ships. They could establish 3 additional colony systems. In exchange, they would submit to enhanced monitoring and accept permanent limitations on weapons research. It was, Chen recognized, exactly the kind of compromise that the Coalition expected to work. A species facing the combined might of galactic civilization would accept whatever concessions were offered, rather than risk complete destruction. The Coalition had used this approach successfully for centuries when dealing with troublesome younger races, but the Coalition had made two fundamental errors in their assessment. First, they continued to underestimate the scope of human military capabilities. Second, they had failed to understand that humanity's objectives were not negotiable. Chen activated her secure communications array, establishing contact with Admiral Torres at Earth Command and Admiral Harrison commanding Stealth Group Alpha in the Centauri system. "The Coalition has rejected our terms," Chen reported. "They're offering modified concessions, but maintaining the fundamental principle of external control over human expansion." Torres's face on the communication screen showed no surprise. The President anticipated this response. "We are authorized to proceed with Phase 3 operations immediately." Admiral Harrison's weathered features reflected decades of military service in the outer colonies, where he had learned that humans survived by being more dangerous than anything trying to kill them. "Admiral Chen," Harrison said, "Stealth Group Alpha is in position to begin the next phase of operations. However, I want to confirm that we have political authorization for actions that will be irreversible." Chen understood Harrison's concerns. Phase 3 would cross lines that could not be uncrossed. Once humanity demonstrated the full scope of their capabilities, there would be no returning to the careful diplomatic game they had been playing. "Admiral Harrison," Chen replied, "the President's authorization is explicit. The Coalition has chosen to maintain a system that treats humanity as a protectorate rather than a sovereign civilization. They have been given the opportunity to reconsider. They have declined." The communication shifted to include feeds from human commanders throughout Coalition space. Admiral Martinez from the Vega sector, Admiral Okafor from the Centauri region, Admiral Kim from the Outer Rim territories, 12 commanders representing over 200,000 human personnel who had been living double lives for the past 2 years. "All commands report ready," Torres announced. "Phase 3 operations will commence in 60 minutes. Remember, the objective is demonstration, not extermination. We want the Coalition to understand our capabilities, not turn this into a war of mutual annihilation." Chen acknowledged the orders and began the process of transitioning from what the humans had privately called their polite phase to something that would provide the Coalition with a more complete understanding of what they were actually dealing with. The first indication that the situation had changed came to the Coalition monitoring stations as energy signatures began appearing throughout their territory. Not the localized spikes that had marked the initial human attacks, but massive power buildups that seemed to violate basic principles of physics. Admiral Thektar, still stationed at the damaged Centauri base, watched his sensors register readings that climbed beyond the maximum scales of his instruments. The human stealth ships that had revealed themselves during the first attack were now showing energy outputs equivalent to entire Coalition battle fleets. "Sensor Chief," Thektar commanded, "explain these readings." The young officer's mandibles clicked rapidly as she consulted her instruments. "Admiral, the human vessels appear to be channeling energy from some form of external source. The power levels are increasing exponentially and show no sign of stabilization." Thektar's tactical brain immediately understood the implications. If the humans could tap into power sources beyond their ship-mounted reactors, then every assumption the Coalition had made about their offensive capabilities was wrong. The first demonstration of Phase 3 technology occurred in the Arcturus system, where Coalition Admiral Thelmar commanded the fleet that had been assembled for the planned invasion of human territory. 400 Coalition capital ships, representing the largest military concentration in decades, faced a single human vessel that had appeared at the edge of the system. The human ship was unlike anything in their previous encounters. Where the Phase 2 vessels had been merely larger and more advanced than expected, this ship seemed to bend space around itself. Stars were visible through sections of its hull, as if parts of the vessel existed in a different dimension. Admiral Thelmar attempted to communicate with the human ship, but received no response to his transmissions. Instead, his sensors began detecting a buildup of exotic energy around the vessel, unlike anything in Coalition experience. The attack, when it came, redefined Coalition understanding of what constituted a weapon. The human ship projected a field that encompassed the entire Coalition fleet. Ships within the field found their weapon systems simply ceasing to function, not damaged or destroyed, but somehow convinced that they had never existed in the first place. Life support continued normally, communications remained active, but every offensive and defensive system became inert. Then the field contracted. In the space of 30 seconds, 400 Coalition capital ships were compressed into a sphere approximately 1 kilometer in diameter. The ships themselves were undamaged, their crews unharmed, but they had been rendered completely immobile and placed in a configuration that made any coordinated action impossible. Admiral Felmar found his flagship pressed against vessels from a dozen other commands, his viewports showing enemy hulls instead of open space. His crew was alive and uninjured, but his fleet had been neutralized as an effective fighting force without a single shot being fired. The human ship broadcast a simple message to the compressed fleet. You are being held in protective custody pending resolution of current diplomatic negotiations. Your safety is guaranteed as long as you do not attempt to interfere with ongoing operations. Similar demonstrations occurred throughout Coalition space. Human forces revealed weapons that seemed to ignore established physics, projectiles that traveled backward through time to strike targets before they were fired, defensive fields that convinced incoming attacks that they had already missed, ships that could apparently exist in multiple locations simultaneously. But perhaps the most disturbing demonstration occurred at the Coalition's primary research facility on the world of Kepler Prime. The installation was responsible for developing the advanced technologies that maintained the Coalition's military superiority, protected by defensive systems that had taken centuries to perfect. The human assault on Kepler Prime consisted of a single individual. Dr. Elena Vasquez materialized inside the facility's most secure laboratory, appearing without triggering any of the sensors or defensive systems that should have detected and eliminated any intruder. The Coalition scientists working in the laboratory found themselves face-to-face with a human woman who seemed completely comfortable in an environment that should have been instantly lethal to any unprotected organic being. "Good afternoon, Dr. Process," Vasquez said in perfect Zeltharan, her words somehow audible despite the lack of atmosphere in the laboratory. "I am here to collect certain research materials that belong to humanity." The lead researcher, Dr. Vazel Kethval, activated the emergency protocols that should have sealed the laboratory and summoned security forces. Nothing happened. The facility's AI system seemed to be ignoring his commands entirely. "Dr. Kethval," Vasquez continued, apparently reading his name from his identification badge despite the fact that human eyes should not have been able to process Zeltharan script, "your research into quantum consciousness manipulation was based on stolen human data. We would like it back." What followed was not theft in any conventional sense. Dr. Vasquez simply approached the facility's central computer core and placed her hand on the access panel. Immediately, terabytes of research data began transferring to storage devices that she produced from nowhere. "How are you doing this?" Dr. Kethval managed to ask. Vasquez smiled with what seemed like genuine warmth. "Doctor, your species has spent considerable effort studying human biology and psychology. What you failed to investigate was human potential. When we told you that we are an adaptable species, we meant something very different from what you understood." As she spoke, the research data continued transferring at rates that exceeded the facility's theoretical bandwidth limits. More disturbing, the data was not being copied but actually moved, disappearing from Coalition systems as it transferred to human storage. "You see," Vasquez explained, "when humans are threatened, we don't just build better weapons or develop new technologies. We evolve. The peace accords gave us 2 years to explore capabilities that most species never discover." Kethval's sensors indicated that several human beings were now present in the laboratory, though he could see only Dr. Vasquez. His instruments suggested that she was somehow existing as multiple individuals simultaneously. "The research you have been conducting," Vasquez continued, "was aimed at understanding how consciousness interfaces with quantum reality. Your goal was to develop technology that could predict and control human behavior by manipulating the quantum foundations of thought itself." The implications hit Dr. Kethval like a physical blow. The Coalition's ultimate plan had been to control humanity at the most fundamental level, making resistance impossible by altering the quantum structures that enabled consciousness. "Unfortunately for your plans," Vasquez said, "humans have been interfacing with quantum consciousness for our entire evolutionary history. You were not studying us. You were studying a pale reflection of what we actually are." The data transfer completed, and Dr. Vasquez began to fade from visibility like a quantum ghost returning to probability space. "Doctor," she said as she disappeared, "please inform your superiors that what you have witnessed represents the 3rd phase of human capability demonstration. We have a 4th phase, but we sincerely hope it will not be necessary to demonstrate it." Throughout Coalition space, similar demonstrations were occurring. Human capabilities that seemed to violate causality, technology that appeared to be based on principles that Coalition science insisted were impossible, individuals who could apparently alter reality through will alone. The message was clear. The military demonstrations of Phase 2 had revealed only a fraction of what humanity was capable of. The Coalition faced an enemy that had spent 2 years not just preparing for war, but evolving into something that transcended their understanding of what warfare could be. Admiral Thektar received the reports from across Coalition space with growing comprehension of how completely they had misjudged the human threat. The peace accords had not been designed to contain a species that could build better ships. They had been aimed at controlling a force of nature that had learned to think strategically. As he prepared his report for the Coalition Council, Thektar realized that the question was no longer whether humanity could be defeated. The question was whether galactic civilization could survive the attempt to try. The second emergency session of the Galactic Coalition Council convened in an atmosphere of barely controlled panic. The representatives who had gathered just days earlier to discuss human military capabilities now faced reports that challenged their fundamental understanding of reality itself. Chancellor Vortak called the session to order with hands that trembled slightly, his usual composure shattered by the briefing materials that had arrived throughout the previous 24 hours. The holographic displays surrounding the chamber showed impossible images. Coalition fleets compressed into geometric impossibilities, research facilities penetrated by individuals who seemed to exist outside normal space-time, weapons that rewrote the laws of physics with each firing. "Esteemed colleagues," Vortak began, his voice lacking its customary authority, "we convene to address developments that appear to exceed our capacity for rational analysis. Supreme Military Commander Keltar will provide an assessment of current strategic options. Keltar's crystalline carapace had shifted to patterns that indicated extreme stress, colors that his species displayed only when facing existential threats. His report began with words that had never been spoken in the Coalition Council chambers. Honored Council, it is my assessment that the Coalition faces an enemy against whom military victory is impossible." The chamber erupted in chaos as representatives from 47 species attempted to process this unprecedented admission of defeat. The Aquatic Federation's delegation released chemical signals indicating distress. The Machine Collective's representatives began calculating at rates that threatened to overload their processing matrices. Keltar continued over the noise. "The human demonstrations over the past 24 hours suggest capabilities that transcend our understanding of technological limitation. They appear to have access to forms of physics that our science considers purely theoretical." Ambassador Takara of the Philosophical Union managed to gain recognition through the chaos. "Commander, are you suggesting that humans have developed technologies beyond our ability to counter?" "Ambassador," Keltar replied, "I am suggesting that they may have developed beyond the concept of technology as we understand it. The individuals who penetrated our most secure facilities did not use tools or devices. They seemed to manipulate reality directly through conscious intent." The implication silenced the chamber more effectively than any call for order. A species that could alter reality through will alone represented something outside the normal parameters of galactic civilization. Ambassador Selin's translucent form shifted to colors, indicating deep philosophical confusion. "Commander, if humans possess such capabilities, why did they engage in diplomatic negotiations at all? Why not simply impose their will upon the galaxy?" Keltar activated displays showing detailed analysis of human actions throughout the crisis. "Ambassador, this question has been central to our strategic assessment. Human behavior suggests that their primary objective is not conquest, but recognition of sovereignty." The tactical displays showed a pattern that Coalition analysts had initially missed. Despite their overwhelming demonstrations of power, human forces had not occupied any Coalition territory. They had not targeted civilian populations. They had not attempted to establish control over Coalition governments or resources. Every human action, Keltar explained, has been designed to demonstrate capability while minimizing casualties. Even their most aggressive operations included provisions for the safety of Coalition personnel. Chancellor Vortak's confusion was evident in his posture. If their objective is recognition rather than conquest, why not accept the modified terms we offered? Because, Honored Chancellor, the modified terms still assumed Coalition authority over human development. The humans appear to consider external control over their expansion to be unacceptable, regardless of the specific limitations involved. Ambassador Morden of the Commercial Guild raised the economic implications that concerned his constituency. "Commander, what would unrestricted human expansion mean for the established trade networks and resource allocations that maintain galactic stability?" Keltar's response revealed analysis that painted an even more complex picture. "Ambassador, human expansion appears to be primarily focused on exploration rather than resource extraction. Their colonies are designed for self-sufficiency, and they have shown little interest in competing for territories currently claimed by Coalition members. The displays shifted to show human expansion patterns over the past century. Unlike other species, humans had consistently chosen systems that other civilizations considered marginal or worthless. Worlds with extreme climates, asteroid belts with limited resources, regions of space that offered no strategic advantages. Human expansion, Keltar continued, seems driven by curiosity rather than economic or military necessity. They appear to settle anywhere they can survive, regardless of whether the location offers material advantages. Ambassador Veltar of the Resource Consortium immediately recognized the implications. Commander, if humans can survive in environments that other species consider uninhabitable, their expansion potential is essentially unlimited. It was the realization that finally broke through the Coalition's psychological barriers. They faced a species that could not be contained by traditional means because they were not expanding for traditional reasons. Humans would settle anywhere they could reach, driven by motivations that Coalition psychology could barely comprehend. Chancellor Vorthak called for a recess, but before the session could adjourn, alarms began sounding throughout the chamber. An unscheduled communication was being received from human sources, transmitted simultaneously to every Coalition facility in known space. The image that appeared on the central display was not Admiral Chen or any other military commander. Instead, the Council found themselves looking at an elderly human woman in civilian clothing, seated in what appeared to be a comfortable office overlooking a garden. "Honored members of the Galactic Coalition Council," the woman began, her voice carrying an authority that seemed to transcend military rank or political position. "I am President Maria Santos of the United Earth Federation. I am addressing you personally to offer final terms for the resolution of our current disagreement." President Santos spoke with the calm demeanor of someone accustomed to making decisions that affected the lives of billions. Her words carried no hint of threat or aggression, only the quiet certainty of someone who held an unbeatable hand. "Over the past week, you have witnessed demonstrations of human military capabilities," Santos continued. "These demonstrations were designed to illustrate that humanity cannot be controlled through force or the threat of force. What you may not have realized is that these capabilities represent only a small fraction of what we have developed." The president gestured to something off-screen, and new displays began appearing throughout the council chamber. Technical specifications for technologies that made the previous demonstrations seem primitive by comparison. Ships that could traverse the galaxy instantaneously, weapons that could eliminate stars, defenses that could protect entire solar systems. "The technologies you have seen," Santos explained, "were developed specifically for the purpose of gaining your attention. They represent what humans can accomplish when we focus our efforts on solving military problems. What they do not represent is what we prefer to accomplish." The displays shifted to show images from human colonies throughout the galaxy, cities that existed in harmony with their environments. Technologies that enhanced life rather than threatening it, art and science and exploration driven by curiosity rather than conquest. "We offered you our friendship," Santos continued, "and you responded by attempting to limit our growth as a civilization. We offered you partnership, and you demanded submission. You studied our history and concluded that we were a threat to galactic stability." President Santos paused, allowing the council to absorb her words. "You were not wrong. We are a threat to stability, as you define it. We represent change, growth, and the refusal to accept limitations imposed by others. If that threatens the established order, then the established order is incompatible with human existence." Chancellor Vorthak found his voice. "President Santos, what are you proposing?" Santos smiled with what seemed like genuine warmth. "Chancellor, I am proposing that you stop proposing. Humanity does not require Coalition permission to expand, explore, or defend ourselves. We do not accept limitations on our development or restrictions on our activities."
The president's expression became more serious.
"However, we have no interest in ruling over other species or imposing our values on civilizations that prefer different approaches to existence. We want to be left alone to pursue our destiny as we see fit." Ambassador Takara leaned forward in her seat. "President Santos, what guarantee do we have that human expansion will not threaten existing coalition members?" "Ambassador," Santos replied, "the same guarantee that we had when we signed the peace accords. None whatsoever. The difference is that now you understand what we are capable of if we are threatened." The brutal honesty of the response silenced the chamber. Santos was not offering reassurances or diplomatic platitudes. She was stating facts. "The galaxy is vast," Santos continued. "There is room for both human expansion and coalition stability, provided you do not attempt to control our activities. If you do attempt such control, you will discover that our current demonstrations have been restrained to an extent you cannot imagine." President Santos stood, her image dominating the displays throughout the chamber. You have 48 hours to decide whether you can accept the existence of a truly independent human civilization. If the answer is yes, we will withdraw our forces to human space and limit our activities to exploration and colonization. If the answer is no, you will discover what Phase 4 capabilities look like. The transmission ended, leaving the Council in stunned silence. They faced a choice that would determine the future of galactic civilization: accept the existence of a species they could not control, or risk everything in an attempt to maintain dominance over a force that had already demonstrated the ability to transcend their understanding of what was possible. Chancellor Vorthak looked around the chamber at representatives whose civilizations had never faced an equal challenge to their authority. For 3,000 years, the Coalition had guided galactic development through careful control and managed expansion. Now they faced a species that rejected control entirely and possessed the power to enforce that rejection. The vote, when it came, was closer than anyone had expected. 24 civilizations voted to accept human independence. 23 voted to continue resistance. It was Ambassador Takara who cast the deciding vote, her words carrying the weight of philosophical analysis that transcended immediate political concerns. "The humans are correct," she said simply. "Change is inevitable. We can either adapt to it or be swept away by it. I vote for adaptation." 3 months later, Admiral Sarah Chen stood again before the viewport of the UNS Defiance, but this time she was watching human colonization ships departing for systems that had never known intelligent life. The galaxy was vast, and humanity had finally gained the freedom to explore it. The peace accords had been replaced by something simpler and more honest: mutual recognition of sovereignty. The Coalition continued to govern its member species through consensus and careful guidance. Humanity expanded throughout the galaxy according to its own vision of what civilization could become. Both approaches would continue to exist, side by side, in a universe large enough to accommodate different definitions of progress. The war that could have destroyed galactic civilization had ended not with conquest, but with the recognition that some forces could not be contained, only acknowledged. Humanity had arrived fully armed not to conquer the galaxy, but to claim their place within it as equals rather than subjects. The peace treaty had indeed been a lie. The reality that replaced it was far more dangerous and infinitely more honest.